She was 19 years old, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left to speak of, no plan to follow, just a small brass plumb bob in her pocket and the $87 her uncle had given her for her share of the world. And with that $87, she bought a worthless deed to an abandoned railroad depot at the end of a forgotten spur line in the Colorado high country. But what nobody knew, what the dismissive clerk at the land office certainly never guessed, was that sealed inside the stone walls of that depot was a room that was never meant to be found, and a life that was waiting to be claimed. Settle in close for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ruth Fenwick learned the language of wood and iron at her grandfather's knee. His name was Elias Fenwick, and for 40 years he had been a carpenter for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, a man whose hands understood the precise angle to cut a trestle support and the right way to seat a spike so it would hold against a century of ice and sun. He was a quiet man, widowed young, who raised his son and then helped raise his granddaughter in a small house that smelled perpetually of sawdust and boiled coffee. Ruth's parents were gentle, bookish people, lost to a winter fever when she was 12, and it was Elias who became her whole world. He never spoke to her as if she were a child, but as if she were a fellow apprentice. He taught her how to read a surveyor's map, how to true a board with a hand plane until it was as smooth as riverstone, and how to listen to the grain of a piece of timber to know its strength. Her most prized possession was a small, heavy plumb bob made of solid brass, its surface worn to a soft gleam from his pocket. "Everything starts from true," he'd told her, placing it in her small hand. "Find your vertical line, and you can build anything that will stand." He taught her competence not as a virtue, but as a form of breathing. You did a thing correctly because that was the only way it could be done. After he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, the house fell to his only surviving child, Ruth's uncle, a man named Thomas, who lived 2 states away and saw the world not in board feet and steel rails, but in assets and liabilities. Thomas arrived a week after the funeral, his face a mask of pinched duty. He was a man who moved through his father's house as if it were a collection of inventory, his eyes calculating the value of the worn furniture, the stacked cords of firewood, the tools hanging in their neat rows in the workshop. Ruth, numb with a grief that felt too large for her small frame, watched him from the kitchen doorway. He did not speak of Elias, her grandfather, but of the estate. He did not ask Ruth what she would do, but informed her of what had been decided. The house was to be sold, he explained, as it was impractical to maintain from a distance. The contents would be auctioned. He had already spoken with a lawyer. The entire process was neat, administrative, and utterly devoid of warmth. The cruelty was not in a raised voice or a harsh word, but in the rustle of papers being signed on the dining room table where her grandfather had once laid out his blueprints. On the final day, after the wagons had hauled away the furniture and the tools, Thomas handed her a thin envelope. "This is your portion," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "It's more than fair. You're 19 now, old enough to make your own way in the world." He did not hug her. He did not wish her well. He simply turned, climbed into his hired buggy, and was gone. Ruth stood on the empty porch, the dust settling around her. Inside the envelope were $87. She went back into the silent house one last time, to the workshop. He had overlooked the small things. She gathered her grandfather's sturdy canvas satchel, a small handsaw, a hammer, a sharp chisel, and the brass plumb bob. She packed what little food was left in the larder, a blanket, and her grandfather's old tin coffee pot. Then she closed the door on the only home she had ever known and walked away, her back straight, her face set. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury, and she had work to do. She walked into town and went to the government land office, a place that smelled of stale paper and indifference. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, barely looked up when she approached. She asked to see the listings for auctioned properties, the unclaimed parcels, the forgotten claims that no one else wanted. He pushed a heavy, dog-eared ledger across the counter with a sigh. She spent 2 hours poring over the spidery script, her finger tracing the lines of faded survey maps, her mind recalling her grandfather's lessons. She passed over exhausted mining claims and arid homestead plots. Then she found it. A single entry for a railroad terminus depot, Section 14, Township 7, on the defunct Argenta Spur line. The note simply said, "Property of the liquidated Argenta Silver and Rail Company, structures abandoned." The price was $85. The clerk chuckled when she pointed to it. "That's nothing but a pile of rocks at the end of nowhere, miss. Line's been closed 30 years. No road goes up there." Ruth met his gaze. "I'll take it." She counted out the money, her hands steady, and he stamped the deed with a final dismissive thud. The journey began the next morning. She followed the main line out of town for half a day, until she found the place where the Argenta Spur diverged, its rails rusting and half swallowed by grass. For 3 days, she walked. The path was her guide, a faint iron scar curving through the vast, silent landscape of the high country. The first day was through rolling foothills, the air warm and smelling of pine and dust. By the second day, the grade steepened, and the mountains began to rise around her like stone giants. The wind grew colder, carrying the sharp scent of snow from the highest peaks. She walked with a steady, enduring rhythm, her boots crunching on the gravel of the railbed. At night, she built a small fire in the lee of a rock outcropping, boiled coffee in her grandfather's tin pot, and ate her dwindling supply of dry bread and salted pork. She slept wrapped in her single blanket, the brass plumb bob a cold, reassuring weight in her pocket. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the whisper of the wind through the lodgepole pines. She was utterly alone, yet she did not feel lost. She was following a line, and a line always led somewhere. On the afternoon of the third day, the valley narrowed into a tight canyon, and the tracks, which had been clinging to the side of the mountain, made a final, sharp curve and simply ended. And there it was. The depot was not a pile of rocks, as the clerk had said. It was a fortress. It was built of massive, rough-hewn granite blocks, fitted together with the precision of a master stonemason. The roof was heavy slate, and the building was anchored into the mountainside itself, as if it had grown there. It was larger than she had expected, with a long, raised loading platform and a smaller attached structure that must have been the station office. But it was sealed. Utterly and completely sealed. The great cargo doors were boarded over with thick planks, nailed from the outside. The heads of the nails rusted deep into the wood. The windows were not merely shuttered, but blocked from within, with solid wood panels visible through the grimy glass. There was no handle on the office door, only a flat plate of iron where a knob should have been. It was not a building that had been abandoned. It was a building that had been entombed. Ruth walked its perimeter 3 times, her hand trailing along the cold stone. It felt final, impregnable. She spent the rest of the daylight methodically searching for a weakness. She tested every board, pushed on every stone. Nothing moved. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, she sat on the edge of the loading platform, a profound sense of exhaustion settling over her. And then she saw it. Low on the foundation wall, half hidden by overgrown thistle, was a small cast-iron ventilation grate. It was no different from the others set along the base, except for one thing. The iron was less rusted, the mortar surrounding it a slightly paler shade of gray. It looked newer. Her heart gave a small, steady thump of purpose. Using the claw of her hammer and the edge of her chisel, she began to work at the mortar. It was stubborn, but it gave way, bit by gritty bit. Finally, with a great deal of effort, she pried the grate free. Behind it was not solid stone, but a dark, narrow opening, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air that flowed from the opening was cold and still, carrying the scent of dust and deep, undisturbed time. Ruth lit the small lantern she carried, tied a rope to a nearby rail anchor, and lowered herself into the darkness. The tunnel was small and lined with stone, clearly man-made, and it sloped gently downwards for about 15 feet before opening into the depot's main storage area. She stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes, and held the lantern high. The space was immense, the ceiling lost in shadow. Crates and barrels stood in silent rows, all of them covered in a thick blanket of dust that softened their edges. Light from the grimy windows filtered through in hazy, golden shafts. It was a place of perfect preservation, a moment frozen for 30 years. She made her way to the smaller office. Inside, a heavy oak desk stood against one wall, a captain's chair before it. On the desk sat a ledger, closed, and an inkwell, long dry. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood. With a creak of protest, she opened the desk drawer. Inside was a single sheaf of papers held together by a clip. It was a cargo manifest, the last one ever written for the Argenta Spur. But the cargo listed wasn't silver ore or mining equipment. It was barrels of flour, sacks of beans, crates of tinned goods, boxes of nails and screws, new axes, saws, hammers, rope, blankets, and kerosene. It was a shipment of everything a person would need to survive a long, isolated winter. A final line was written at the bottom in a neat, clear hand. Consignee S. Croft. Hold at terminus. The cargo had never left. It was all still here. For a moment she felt a strange sense of trespass, of peering into a private history. She left the office and began a more careful inspection of the main room. It was then she noticed what she had missed in the gloom. Along the back wall, the long vertical planks of dark pine were not uniform. For a section about 8 feet wide, the dust lay differently. The seams between the boards were too clean, too perfect. There were no cobwebs. She pushed, and one of the planks gave slightly under her hand. There was no knob, no latch, but she found the edge and pulled. A section of the wall swung inward with a quiet groan, revealing not stone behind it, but a small, hidden room. Inside was a narrow bed, neatly made, a small potbelly stove, its pipe cleverly vented through a hidden flue, a bookshelf holding a dozen worn volumes, and on a small, simple table, another leather-bound ledger and a sealed, yellowed envelope addressed in that same neat hand, to a stubborn soul. She sat on the edge of the simple wooden chair, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal. The paper was thick and dry, the ink faded but perfectly legible. She read the letter aloud, her voice a quiet presence in the profound silence. To whoever finds this place, My name is Silas Croft. I was the station master here, and the man who built this depot for the Argenta Company. I drew the plans and cut the stone myself, with 2 good men to help. We finished in the autumn of 1883. The silver vein they were chasing ran out before the first ore car ever made it down the line. The company folded by Christmas. They paid me what they owed and told me the line was closed. They never came back. The men left. I stayed. This place, you see, was the best thing I ever built. It is true and square. The foundation is sound. I could not bring myself to leave it to rot. I ordered one last shipment on the company's credit, just before the news of the collapse became official. It was everything I thought I would need. I used the tools to seal the main doors from the inside and to build this small room where I could be warm. The tunnel you found was my way in and out. I lived here for 6 years. They were good years, quiet years. I had my books, the mountains, and work enough to keep me occupied. But a man's time is not infinite. My heart has grown tired, and the winters have grown longer. I am leaving what remains. The supplies in the storeroom are yours. The tools are sharp. I have kept them so. In the ledger on this table you will find my journals and a map I drew of the good hunting grounds and the place where the creek runs sweet all year. I do not know who you are or what trouble led you to a place so far from the world, but I have a feeling you are not here by accident. A place like this does not call to the idle or the careless. It calls to someone who needs a foundation. I hope it serves you well. I hope you find a measure of peace within these stone walls as I did. Build something that will stand. Silas Croft, Station Master, Argenta Terminus, May, 1889. Ruth carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She looked around the small, perfect room, at the neatly folded blanket on the bed, at the handful of worn books. She had arrived here an orphan, with nothing but a few tools and a worthless deed, and a man she had never met, a stranger dead for decades, had left her a home, a pantry, and a legacy of quiet competence. For the first time since her uncle had driven away, she lowered her head into her hands, and she wept. Not for what she had lost, but for the astonishing, unexpected kindness of what she had found. The next morning, Ruth began her work. Her grief had been washed clean by the tears and replaced with a clear, calm purpose. She was no longer a trespasser. She was an heir. Her first task was to open the depot to the world. Using a heavy crowbar and a sledgehammer from Silas's magnificent tool chest, she attacked the great cargo doors from the inside. The thick planks splintered and groaned, and the rusted nails shrieked as they were pulled from the frame. Finally, with a great heave, the last board gave way, and she was able to slide back the massive iron bolt that had held the doors shut for 30 years. They swung open with a deep, resonant groan, and the brilliant mountain sunlight flooded the cavernous space, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like 1,000 tiny stars. It felt like the building itself was taking its first breath in a generation. She spent the next week in a fever of labor. She swept the floors, the dust of decades rising in clouds around her. She washed the grimy windows until they shone, revealing a breathtaking vista of the valley below. She took inventory, carefully checking the contents of every crate and barrel against Silas's final manifest. It was all there, preserved by the cold, dry air. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, tinned peaches, smoked hams, tools of every description, bolts of canvas, kegs of nails. It was a treasure beyond imagining. One afternoon, while clearing brush from around the loading dock, she was startled by a voice. Well, I'll be. Thought this place was a ghost. An old man stood there, lean and weathered as a pine stump, a long rifle cradled in his arm. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a trapper who worked the high valleys. He had seen the smoke from her chimney and had come to investigate. He stared in amazement at the open depot, the clean windows, the neatly stacked supplies. Ruth simply nodded and offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a grateful sigh. She told him a part of the story, that she had bought the deed and was fixing the place up. He listened, his shrewd eyes taking in her worn clothes, her capable hands, and the quiet determination in her face. Before he left, he pointed to a massive, fire-scarred pine that had fallen near the tracks, blocking the path. That tree's a menace, liable to slide in a spring melt. I'll come back with my mule tomorrow. We'll clear it. He returned the next day as promised, and together they spent the day with saws and axes, cutting the great log into sections and rolling it away. When they were finished, Ruth insisted he take a tin of peaches and a small sack of coffee for his trouble. He just grunted. Fair trade. It was the beginning. A few weeks later, a Ute woman named Amay appeared at the door, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. She had been gathering herbs in the valley and had heard of the girl at the old depot. She looked at the slate roof, where a few tiles were missing. Without a word, she led Ruth up the mountain to a hidden shale deposit and showed her how to split the rock into perfect, thin shingles. She taught her which plants were for medicine and which were for soup. In return, Ruth gave her a warm blanket and 2 new knives from Silas's stock. Then came Mr. Abernathy, a traveling blacksmith with a portable forge on his wagon, who helped her repair the hinges on the cargo doors, his hammer ringing a clear, metallic song in the mountain air. He marveled at the quality of Silas's tools. A man who cared for his tools, he said, which Ruth knew was the highest form of praise. They did not speak of friendship, these solitary people. They spoke of work, of fair trade, of things that needed doing. A community was not declared. It was built, one practical kindness at a time. The seasons turned, and the depot, which Ruth now called Croft's End in honor of its first master, settled into a new life. The smoke from its chimney became a landmark, a sign of warmth and shelter in the vast wilderness. Jedediah made it a regular stop on his trap lines, trading fine beaver and marten pelts for flour, salt, and the occasional tin of peaches. He would sit by her fire, sipping coffee, and share news from the lower valleys, his quiet presence a comfortable habit. Amay would visit every few weeks, bringing bundles of dried herbs or a string of fresh-caught trout, and she and Ruth would sit on the loading dock in the sun, shelling beans or mending canvas, speaking little but understanding much. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his route to pass by twice a year, sharpening her axes and saw blades and repairing any metalwork that needed attention. He brought news from the wider world, and always a piece of hard candy for her, a small, gruff gesture of affection. Other people began to find their way to her door, prospectors chasing rumors of gold, surveyors mapping the wild country, lone travelers seeking a safe place to spend the night. Croft's End was not a town, nor a store in the formal sense. It was simply a place that was, a point of certainty in an uncertain land. Ruth became the keeper of it. She was no longer Ruth Fenwick, the dismissed orphan. She was Ruth of Croft's End. Her name was now tied to a place, to a function. She traded goods from Silas's storeroom, her ledger filling with a careful accounting of debits and credits. She learned the rhythms of the mountains, the signs of a coming storm, the best time to plant a small garden in the patch of sun by the south wall. She repaired the loading dock with fresh timber, using the precise, careful techniques her grandfather had taught her. She replaced the broken slates on the roof with the ones Amay had shown her how to cut. Every nail she hammered, every board she trued, was an affirmation of her place in the world. The depot was no longer an abandoned shell, but a living, breathing part of the landscape. Its stone walls warmed by her fire, its great room filled with the scent of baking bread and oiled wood. It had transformed from a burden of stone and shadow into a refuge, a livelihood, and a home. One clear, cold evening in late autumn, Ruth stood in the great, open doorway of the cargo bay, looking out as the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold. A fire crackled in the potbelly stove, and the air was filled with the comforting smell of pine smoke and the simmering venison stew Jedediah had taught her how to make. The depot was quiet, settled for the night. The tools were clean and hung in their proper places on the wall. The floor was swept, and the lantern cast a warm, steady glow over the space she had built with her own two hands. In one hand, she held the brass plumb bob her grandfather had given her, its weight familiar and grounding. On the workbench beside her sat a small, exquisitely carved wooden chickadee, something she had found tucked away in one of Silas Croft's books. She often thought of the two men, Elias and Silas, who had shaped her life. One had given her the skills to build, the other had given her a place to begin. They were strangers to one another, connected only by her, by their shared belief in things that were built to last. She thought of her uncle, of the cold finality in his eyes and the thin envelope of cash he had pressed into her hand. He had intended it as a dismissal, an ending. He had cast her out with what he considered nothing, but he had been wrong. That act of abandonment had not been an end. It had been a bearing, a true north that had pointed her here. He had severed her from her past, and in doing so, had freed her to find a future she could never have imagined. The loneliness she had felt on that long walk up the tracks was gone, replaced by a profound sense of belonging that was as solid and real as the granite walls around her. This was her place. She had found it, she had reclaimed it, and she had made it her own. Ruth Fenwick was 19 years old and had been sent into the world alone. She had $87 to her name, and she spent $85 of it on a forgotten deed at the end of an abandoned rail line. It was the best $85 she ever spent. We hope the story of Ruth and the kindness of a stranger has brought a little warmth to your evening. If it has, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to be reminded that value can be found in the most abandoned of places. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and unexpected grace. And now we leave you with this thought. What forgotten place or overlooked thing in your own life might just be waiting for a stubborn soul to come along and see its true worth? Thank you for being with us.